The first time Margaret Hayes held her grandson, the room should have been filled with joy. Instead, silence settled over the hospital room like a dark cloud. Emily lay weak against the white hospital pillows, exhaustion pulling at every muscle in her body. After 16 painful hours of labor, all she wanted was to hold her newborn son close and breathe in the soft, sweet scent of his tiny head. Her husband, Daniel, stood beside her, his eyes wet with tears as he gently brushed Noah's dark hair with trembling fingers. "He's perfect," Daniel whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Emily smiled faintly. "He looks just like you." The baby's tiny fingers curled around Daniel's thumb, and for a moment everything felt right. Then Margaret spoke. She stood stiffly near the foot of the hospital bed, her expensive navy coat draped sharply over her narrow shoulders. Her lips tightened as she stared at Noah with unsettling intensity. "He has green eyes." The words were flat, almost accusing. Daniel frowned. "Mom, newborn's eye color changes." Margaret crossed her arms. "Not usually." Emily felt her stomach tighten. From the day Daniel had introduced her to his mother 3 years ago, Margaret had made it painfully clear she didn't approve. Emily came from a modest background, a schoolteacher raised by a widowed father, while Margaret had spent decades cultivating the image of upper-class perfection. To Margaret, Emily had never been good enough for her only son. "She trapped you." Margaret had once whispered to Daniel at their engagement party, loud enough for Emily to hear. Daniel had defended her then, but Margaret never stopped. Every holiday dinner came with subtle insults. Every family gathering carried some cruel remark disguised as concern. And now, on the day Emily should have felt nothing but happiness, Margaret's cold stare made her chest ache. The nurse entered to check Noah's vitals, breaking the tension. "He's healthy and beautiful," she said warmly. Margaret gave a thin smile. "Yes," she said, "beautiful, but he doesn't look like a Hayes." Emily's breath caught. Daniel stiffened. "Mom." Margaret lifted a hand. "I'm simply making an observation." Emily looked down at Noah, suddenly protective in a way she had never experienced before. He was perfect. He was hers. And no one, not even Margaret, would taint this moment. 2 weeks later, Emily hoped the strange comment would fade into memory. Instead, it became something much worse. Margaret insisted on hosting a welcome home family dinner at her large estate, inviting nearly every relative in the Hayes family. Emily had hesitated. Something about the invitation felt wrong, but Daniel had squeezed her hand. "She's trying," he said. "Let's give her a chance." So Emily dressed carefully, choosing a soft cream blouse and holding Noah close as they arrived. Margaret greeted them at the door with an air, kiss and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The dining room glittered with polished silverware and crystal glasses. Daniel's aunts, uncles, and cousins filled the room with chatter. For a brief moment, Emily allowed herself to believe Daniel was right. Maybe Margaret was trying. Dinner passed with forced politeness. Then dessert was served. Margaret rose slowly, tapping her spoon against her glass. The room fell silent. "I'd like to make a toast," she announced. Daniel smiled. "That's nice, Mom." Margaret's gaze shifted to Emily. "To family," she said smoothly, "and to truth." A strange chill crawled down Emily's spine. Margaret set her glass down. "There's something we need to address." Daniel frowned. "What are you talking about?" Margaret inhaled dramatically. "As much as I adore this child, there are questions that deserve answers." The room went still. Emily's pulse thundered. "What questions?" Daniel asked sharply. Margaret turned to him with theatrical sadness. "Daniel, look at him." She gestured toward Noah, sleeping peacefully in Emily's arms. "His green eyes, his features, nothing about him resembles our family." Emily stared in disbelief. "You cannot be serious." Margaret ignored her. "I've done research. 2 brown-eyed parents rarely produce a green-eyed child." "That's not true," Emily snapped. Margaret's voice sharpened. Then perhaps you can explain why your son looks nothing like a haze. The accusation hung in the air like poison. Emily felt every face in the room turn toward her. No, this couldn't be happening. Margaret, Daniel said firmly, stop. But Margaret pressed on. I think we all deserve honesty, especially my son. Emily's cheeks burned. Are you accusing me of cheating? Margaret tilted her head. If there's nothing to hide, then a DNA test should settle this. Gasps rippled through the room. Emily looked to Daniel, desperate for him to shut this down. He stared at his mother in stunned silence. That silence cut deeper than any accusation. Tears stung Emily's eyes. You actually believe this, she whispered, Daniel's face twisted with conflict. No, Emily, but he didn't deny it quickly enough. And that hesitation shattered her. Emily rose carefully, clutching Noah. I just gave birth to your son, she said, her voice trembling. And this is what your family does. Margaret folded her hands. If you're innocent, you have nothing to fear. The cruelty in her calm tone was unbearable. Emily looked around the table. Some relatives avoided her eyes. Others watched with thinly veiled curiosity. Humiliation washed over her. Then something inside her hardened. She lifted her chin. Fine, Daniel blinked. Emily, no. Her voice came out stronger than she felt. You want a DNA test, you'll have one. Margaret smiled faintly, as though she'd already won. But Emily stepped closer, her gaze locked on her mother-in-law. And when it proves Noah is Daniel's son, I want every single person in this room to remember what you did tonight. Margaret's smile faltered. Emily turned to Daniel. If you trust me, stand by me. He looked stricken. I do trust you. Then prove it. Without another word, Emily walked out of the dining room, Noah cradled tightly against her chest. Behind her, she heard Daniel call her name, but all she could hear was Margaret's accusation echoing in her mind. She slid into the passenger seat of their car, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. As she looked at her sleeping son, a fierce determination rose inside her. Margaret wanted proof. She would get it, and when the truth came out, Emily would make sure Margaret regretted ever questioning her. What Emily didn't know was that the DNA test would expose far more than Margaret's cruel lie. It would uncover a secret buried for over 30 years, one that would destroy everything Margaret had built. The drive home that night was suffocatingly silent. Rain tapped softly against the windshield as Daniel gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles pale beneath the dashboard lights. Emily sat beside him in rigid silence, cradling Noah against her chest. Their son slept peacefully, unaware that his existence had become the center of a cruel family scandal. Neither of them spoke until they reached home. The moment the front door shut behind them, Emily carefully placed Noah in his crib and turned to face her husband. Well, she asked. Daniel looked exhausted, his face shadowed with guilt. Emily, no. Her voice trembled, but she forced herself to stay steady. You don't get to say my name like that and pretend everything is fine. He ran a hand through his hair. I didn't agree with my mother. You didn't stop her either. The words hit him hard. His jaw tightened. She caught me off guard. She accused me of cheating in front of your entire family, Daniel. I know. No, you don't know. Tears burned behind Emily's eyes. You didn't feel what it was like to stand there holding our baby while your mother looked at me like I was filth. Daniel stepped closer. I'm sorry. Emily folded her arms. Sorry isn't enough. He looked down, unable to meet her gaze. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Daniel exhaled. The DNA test will prove her wrong. Emily stared at him. The fact that he still thought the test was necessary made her chest ache. You still think it needs proving? No, that's not what I mean. Then what do you mean? He hesitated. And once again, that hesitation said everything. Emily turned away, blinking back tears. "Schedule the test," she said quietly. "Emily, do it." If this was what it took to silence Margaret forever, then so be it. The next week was unbearable. Margaret wasted no time spreading her suspicions through the family. Emily learned through Daniel's cousin Sophie that relatives were whispering behind her back. Some claimed she'd had an affair with a coworker. Others speculated that she had trapped Daniel into marriage with another man's child. Every rumor felt like another knife. At the grocery store, Emily caught Daniel's Aunt Patricia staring at Noah with open suspicion. At church, conversations hushed when she passed. The humiliation was relentless, but Margaret seemed to thrive on it. She called Daniel daily, pretending concern. "I'm only trying to protect you," she would say. "She's manipulating you." Men in your position are often too blinded by love to see the truth. Emily overheard enough of these calls to know Margaret wasn't backing down. The DNA appointment was scheduled for Friday morning. The entire week leading up to it felt endless. The night before, Emily sat in Noah's nursery, rocking him gently as moonlight spilled through the curtains. His tiny fingers wrapped around hers. "You shouldn't have to prove who you are," she whispered. A soft knock sounded at the door. Daniel entered quietly. He looked drained. He sat beside her, his voice low. "I've handled this badly." Emily said nothing. He stared at Noah. "I should have shut my mother down immediately." "Yes," Emily said. He swallowed hard. "I was shocked and ashamed that she'd do something so cruel." Emily finally looked at him. "Then why didn't you defend me?" Daniel's eyes glistened. "Because part of me was afraid." Afraid of what? He hesitated, afraid that if I challenged her publicly, it would tear the family apart. Emily let out a bitter laugh. She already did that. He had no answer. After a long silence, he reached for her hand. "I'm sorry." This time, she believed he meant it. But the wound was still there, and trust, once cracked, doesn't heal overnight. The clinic was cold and sterile. Emily sat beside Daniel in the waiting room while Noah slept in his carrier. Margaret had insisted on attending. She sat across from them, dressed immaculately in cream, slacks, and pearls, her posture rigid with confidence. She looked almost smug, as if she already knew the outcome. The technician called their names. The swabs were quick and painless. A simple scrape inside Daniel's cheek, another for Noah. Then it was done. The results will be ready in 5 business days. The technician said. Margaret nodded sharply. "We'll be waiting." Emily said nothing. She simply lifted Noah and walked out. 5 days later, Margaret demanded everyone gather at her house for the results. Emily wanted to refuse. But Daniel insisted, "This ends tonight." So once again, they entered Margaret's gleaming dining room. The same room where Emily had been humiliated, the same polished table, the same judgmental faces. Margaret stood at the head of the room, holding the sealed envelope. Her lips curved into a small, victorious smile. "Thank you all for coming," she said. Daniel's face hardened. "Just open it." Margaret carefully unfolded the papers. The room fell silent. Her eyes scanned the page. And for the first time, Emily saw something Margaret rarely showed. Confusion. Margaret blinked, then read again. Her face drained of color. Daniel stepped forward. "What does it say?" Margaret's hand trembled. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Daniel snatched the paper from her hands. His eyes moved across the results. Then he looked up at Emily. His expression shifted from tension to stunned relief. Probability of paternity, 99. 99%. A wave of murmurs swept through the room. Emily closed her eyes, emotion crashing over her, of course. She had never doubted, but hearing it aloud felt like reclaiming her dignity. Daniel turned sharply to his mother. She told the truth. Margaret's lips parted. "That's impossible." Emily stepped forward. "Impossible?" Margaret's composure cracked. There must be a mistake. The lab technician, who had accompanied them to verify the report, cleared her throat. The results are accurate. Margaret shook her head violently. No. The technician frowned. There was, however, an unusual note attached to the file. The room stilled. What note? Daniel asked. The technician hesitated. During processing, we noticed an unexpected genetic inconsistency in the extended lineage markers your mother requested. Margaret's face turned ghostly pale. Daniel frowned. What does that mean? The technician glanced at Margaret. It suggests a discrepancy in the paternal line. Daniel stared. Margaret suddenly stepped back. That's irrelevant. The technician continued carefully. The markers indicate that Daniel may not be biologically related to the paternal bloodline listed in the family records. The room erupted. What? That can't be right. Margaret's breathing became shallow. Stop this. Daniel looked at her, his face drained of color. Mom, for the first time in his life, he looked at her not with trust but suspicion, and Margaret knew. The secret she had buried for over 30 years had just begun to surface. Emily watched silently as panic flickered across her mother-in-law's face. Margaret had wanted the truth exposed. She had forced this test, and now the truth was coming for her. The room descended into chaos. Voices collided from every direction as shocked relatives stared at Margaret in disbelief. The polished elegance of the Hayes dining room suddenly felt suffocating, as though the walls themselves were closing in. Margaret stood frozen at the head of the table, one trembling hand gripping the back of her chair. This is absurd, she snapped, though her voice lacked its usual sharp authority. There has to be some mistake. The lab technician adjusted her glasses and spoke carefully. The results are highly accurate. The paternity test confirmed that Daniel is unquestionably Noah's biological father. Daniel's eyes softened for the briefest moment as he looked at Emily. Then his attention snapped back to his mother, and the second result. The technician hesitated. The extended lineage markers indicate a discrepancy between Daniel's DNA and the paternal bloodline submitted for comparison. Daniel's face darkened. You're saying my father? She nodded. There is a significant probability that the man listed as your biological father is not genetically related to you. The words landed like thunder. Aunt Patricia gasped loudly. Daniel's cousin Sophie covered her mouth. Across the room, Margaret's brother, Charles, stared at his sister with dawning horror. No, Margaret said sharply. Her voice cracked. No, that's impossible. But no one believed her certainty anymore. Because for the first time, Margaret looked afraid, truly afraid. Daniel took a slow step toward her. Mom, Margaret's eyes darted wildly. This test is flawed. Look at me. She refused. Daniel's voice hardened. Look at me. Slowly, Margaret lifted her gaze. And Emily saw something she had never imagined she would witness in that woman's cold, calculating face. Panic. Daniel held up the report. Tell me the truth. Margaret swallowed. There's nothing to tell. Don't lie to me. The command cracked through the room. For years, Daniel had been the obedient son, the peacemaker who avoided confrontation. Emily had often wondered if he would ever stand fully against his mother. Now she had her answer. Margaret glanced around the room, as if searching for escape. But every eye was fixed on her. Even her husband, Richard Hayes, stood pale and motionless near the fireplace. He had said almost nothing all evening. Now he looked at his wife with a quiet devastation that chilled the room. Margaret, he said softly. The sound of his voice made her flinch. Explain this. Her lips parted. Nothing came out. Richard's face tightened. Explain it. Margaret's carefully composed mask began to crack. Tears filled her eyes, and then, finally, she whispered, "It was one time." The room went dead silent. Richard staggered back as though struck. Daniel stared. What? Margaret's shoulders shook. It was 32 years ago. She said, her voice trembling, You and I had been fighting constantly. You were always away for work. Richard's face twisted with pain. So you cheated. Margaret closed her eyes. It didn't mean anything. Emily felt Daniel stiffen beside her. The confession was unraveling decades of lies in real time. Margaret clasped her hands desperately. I never meant for anyone to know. Daniel's voice was barely audible. Who is he? Margaret's silence answered before her words did. Finally, she whispered, Michael. A collective gasp swept the room. Emily frowned, then realization struck. Michael Bennett, Richard's former best friend. The same man who had abruptly moved away shortly after Daniel was born. Richard's face drained of all color. No. Margaret began sobbing. I thought the baby was yours, but you weren't sure. Her silence was confirmation. Richard looked as though his entire world had shattered. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. You accused Emily. His voice shook with rage. You dragged my wife through hell because of your own lie. Margaret shook her head frantically. That's not why. Then why? She opened her mouth, closed it, and for once Margaret Hayes had no clever answer. Because the truth was ugly, she had projected her own guilt onto Emily. For decades, she had carried the secret of her betrayal, terrified that one day it would surface. When Noah was born with green eyes, a trait unfamiliar to the Hayes family, it triggered the fear she had buried. Instead of confronting her past, she attacked Emily. She accused another woman of the very betrayal she herself had committed. Emily stepped forward, her voice calm but cutting. You wanted everyone to believe I was capable of what you did. Margaret looked at her through tears. Emily held her gaze, all because you couldn't face your own shame. Margaret's face crumpled. Richard turned away from her, unable to even look at her. 32 years of marriage. 32 years built on deception. And now the foundation had collapsed. Daniel stood motionless. Emily reached for his hand. His fingers were ice cold. He stared at his mother as if seeing a stranger. All my life, he said quietly, you controlled everything. You judged everyone. You acted like morality was your greatest virtue. Margaret whispered, Daniel, no. His voice sharpened. You humiliated my wife. You questioned my son. And all along, you were hiding this. The disgust in his tone made Margaret visibly recoil. I was trying to protect you. Daniel laughed bitterly. Protect me. He held up no as test results. You tried to destroy my family. Tears streamed down Margaret's face. I was scared. Good, Emily said. The room turned toward her. Her voice remained steady. Because that fear you're feeling now, that's exactly what you put me through. Margaret looked shattered. For the first time, she had no power, no control, no audience willing to believe her. Her carefully built image of perfection had collapsed completely. One by one, relatives began gathering their things. No one offered Margaret comfort. No one defended her. Even Aunt Patricia, who had eagerly whispered rumors about Emily all week, avoided her gaze as she slipped toward the door. The silence of abandonment settled around Margaret like a sentence. Daniel turned to his father. Richard looked broken. I need time, he said quietly. Then he walked out without another word. Margaret cried out after him, but he never stopped. Daniel looked at Emily. The pain in his eyes was immense, but beneath it was something else, clarity. He wrapped his arm around her shoulders. Let's go. As they reached the doorway, Margaret's weak voice called after them. Daniel, please. He stopped. For a moment, Emily wondered if he would turn back. Instead, he spoke without looking at her. You accused my wife because you couldn't live with your own lies. His voice was cold. You don't get to call yourself family tonight. Then he walked out. The cool night air hit Emily's face as they stepped outside. Behind them, Margaret Hayes remained standing alone in the ruins of the truth she had forced into the light. And as Emily held Noah close, she realized something profound. Margaret had demanded a DNA test to destroy her. Instead, she had exposed the one secret powerful enough to destroy herself. The weeks after Margaret's confession changed everything. For the first time since Emily had married into the Hayes family, the constant pressure that had hovered over her life was gone. No cutting remarks over dinner, no judgmental glances, no passive-aggressive phone calls disguised as concern. The silence from Margaret was absolute, and somehow it was louder than all the cruelty that had come before. The fallout spread quickly through the family. Richard moved out of the Hayes estate and into a quiet apartment across town. He refused Margaret's calls, ignored her messages, and through his attorney began discussing divorce proceedings. The once proud Hayes family name, so carefully guarded by Margaret for decades, had become the center of whispered gossip. The woman who had spent her life policing everyone else's behavior had become the subject of every conversation. For Margaret, it was a humiliation unlike anything she had ever imagined. For Emily, it was justice. But the deepest change was in Daniel. The revelation had shattered him. For days after the dinner, he barely spoke. He moved through their home like a man trying to rebuild himself from broken pieces. One evening, after Noah had finally fallen asleep, Daniel sat beside Emily on the couch. The soft glow of the lamp cast shadows across his tired face. "I failed you," he said quietly. Emily looked at him. He had said sorry before, but this felt different. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't rushed. It was the raw truth. "When my mother accused you, I should have shut it down immediately," he continued. "Instead, I hesitated because I was still trying to protect her." Emily folded her hands tightly in her lap. "She's your mother. That doesn't excuse it." His voice cracked. "I let her hurt you." The pain in his eyes softened something inside her. For weeks, anger had sat between them like an unspoken wall. Now, for the first time, she saw genuine accountability. Daniel reached for her hand. "I can't undo what happened, but I can promise you this: I will never let anyone, including my mother, come between us again." Emily studied him carefully. Trust wasn't something restored with a single apology, but it could begin there. Slowly, she squeezed his hand back. And in that quiet moment, something fragile began to heal. A month later, Daniel made an announcement. "We're hosting Noah's naming celebration here," he said. Emily blinked. "At our house." He nodded. The Hayes family traditionally held major celebrations at Margaret's estate. This would be different. It was more than a party. It was a declaration, a boundary, a reclaiming of their family on their own terms. The invitations were sent to everyone, including Margaret. Emily was surprised. "You want her there." Daniel's expression was calm but firm. "She needs to hear what I have to say." The evening of the celebration arrived bright and warm. Their backyard glowed with string lights, white roses, and softly flickering lanterns. Family members gathered around neatly arranged tables, their conversations filled with cautious warmth. Emily stood near the garden arch holding Noah in her arms. He wore a tiny navy blue outfit, his green eyes bright and curious as he looked around. Daniel stood beside her, his hand resting gently on her back. For once, Emily felt no anxiety. This was her home. Her family, her peace. Then Margaret arrived. A hush fell over the gathering. She looked smaller somehow. Gone was the polished confidence she once carried like armor. She wore a simple gray dress, her shoulders slightly hunched. Her eyes immediately found Noah. Pain flickered across her face. She approached cautiously. "Emily." It was the first time she had ever spoken her name without contempt. Emily gave a small nod. Margaret looked at Daniel. He gestured toward an empty seat. "Sit." She obeyed quietly. As the evening unfolded, laughter slowly returned to the gathering. For the first time, Emily noticed something remarkable. No one revolved around Margaret anymore. The family had shifted. Her approval no longer mattered. and Margaret knew it. When dinner ended, Daniel rose from his seat and tapped his glass. The soft chime silenced the crowd. He looked around at his family, then his eyes found Emily. His voice was steady. "Thank you all for coming tonight to celebrate my son, Noah." He paused, but before we continue, there's something I need to say. Margaret stiffened. Daniel took Emily's free hand. "A few weeks ago, my wife was publicly accused of betrayal." The room fell silent. Emily felt her heartbeat quicken. She was humiliated for no reason other than someone else's fear and dishonesty. Margaret lowered her head. Daniel's grip tightened, and despite that cruelty, Emily showed more dignity, strength, and grace than anyone had the right to expect. His voice softened as he looked at her. "She stood firm when I failed to stand beside her." Tears filled Emily's eyes. Daniel turned to the guests. "I was wrong not to defend her immediately, and I will spend the rest of my life proving that she and Noah come first." He faced Margaret directly. The silence became razor sharp. "Mom," Margaret slowly looked up. "I love you because you are my mother, but love does not erase consequences." Her lips trembled. "You broke our trust." Daniel's voice remained calm. "Until that trust is earned back, there will be boundaries." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She nodded weakly. "I understand." Then, to everyone's surprise, she stood. Turning to Emily, she clasped her shaking hands together. "I was cruel to you." Emily said nothing. Margaret's voice cracked. "I accused you because I was projecting my own guilt. What I did was unforgivable." Tears spilled freely down her face. "I am sorry." The words hung in the warm evening air. For years, Margaret had wielded pride like a weapon. Now, stripped of power, she stood exposed and humbled. Emily looked at her carefully. This apology didn't erase the pain. It didn't undo the sleepless nights, the humiliation, the betrayal, but it was enough not for forgiveness. Not yet, but for closure. Emily gave a small nod. "That's a beginning." Margaret sat down quietly, tears falling. And for the first time, she understood that respect could never be demanded through control. It had to be earned. Daniel raised his glass to Noah. The family echoed the toast to Noah. Laughter and applause filled the garden. Emily looked down at her son. His tiny hand curled around her finger. And as she held him close beneath the glow of the lights, she realized the sweetest revenge had never been exposing Margaret's lie. It was this, a stronger marriage, a united family, a future built on truth instead of fear. Margaret had tried to tear her apart. Instead, she had forced Emily and Daniel to become stronger than ever. And as Noah cooed softly in her arms, Emily smiled. Because, in the end, the truth had not only set her free, it had given her everything Margaret could never take away.